How can a woman remembered for gentleness carry within her a lifetime of unspoken wounds, hidden trials, and heroic surrender? Welcome, dear friends, wherever you are listening tonight. Perhaps in your living room, perhaps on a quiet walk. Settle in, subscribe, and join our peaceful remembrance together this gentle evening. This is the journey of Jane Frances de Chantal, a noble widow whose profound losses, spiritual trials, and unwavering faith shaped the humble beginnings of the Visitation Order, revealing how grace transforms suffering into a legacy of enduring holiness today. And so, with the quiet opening of her story still echoing softly, we enter the beginning of Jane's earthly pilgrimage, moving gently from the question of her hidden sorrows towards the tender simplicity of her earliest days. Jane Frances Fremyot was born on a cold January morning in 1572 in the old city of Dijon, a place of vineyards and stone houses where the rhythm of life followed the seasons and the ancient bells of churches marked the hours with steady calm. From the start, she belonged to a world of nobility, yet her childhood was shaped less by wealth than by the steady warmth of her family home. Her father, President Fremyot, was a man of integrity, a figure of deep prudence and gentle dignity. Under his roof, the world felt ordered, safe, and filled with a kind of steady light that a child accepts without question. For little Jane, this home was a sanctuary, a place where she learned early how faith can be woven naturally into daily life, not as an obligation, but as a silent presence breathing within the walls. In those first years, she was known for a quiet sweetness, a perceptiveness beyond her age, a natural inclination to comfort rather than complain. Neighbors remarked that the child seemed to have been born with a tenderness stitched into her soul, as if God had placed within her a delicate thread of compassion that would one day hold much weight. Yet even the gentlest beginnings are touched by sorrow. When Jane was still young, her mother died, leaving a silence in the household that no amount of order or nobility could fill. Children feel grief differently than adults. They do not always speak of it, yet they understand in a deep and wordless way when something irreplaceable has gone. Jane felt the absence as a hollow room inside her heart, a space she carried quietly as her father tried, with tenderness and firmness, to raise his children alone. Perhaps it was then, in the early ache of this loss, that she first sensed God not only in joy, but also in the mysterious softness that surrounds suffering. There were moments when she would stand in the chapel at home, looking at the flickering candles, wondering why some flames burned strong while others sputtered. She did not know how to put it into words, but she began to understand, almost instinctively, that the human heart, too, has flames that rise and fall, and that perhaps God is near in both. President Fremyot, for his part, noticed his daughter's depth and cultivated in her a thoughtful spirit. He ensured she received a refined education, one rare for women of her time, teaching her not only reading and domestic skill, but also reflection, clarity, and moral insight. Jane absorbed everything eagerly. She loved stories of saints, but not in the way children often do, for entertainment or marvel. She listened for something deeper, a kind of direction, a quiet map for the soul. Her family chaplain tended to believe that God sometimes whispered uniquely to certain souls even from childhood, and he suspected Jane was one of them. But if this was true, Jane herself did not yet realize it. She lived with the natural joy of a child who had suffered and still knew how to hope. As she grew into youth, her character became a gentle balance of serenity and strength. She was known for her calm manner, for the way she listened before speaking, for the soft intelligence shining behind her eyes. In an age marked by religious conflict, distrust, and unrest across France, she carried a peacefulness that made her stand out. Her father often said that she reminded him of her mother, a woman capable of holding both tenderness and resolve. Sometimes at dusk, Jane would walk in the garden, gathering the cool evening air into her lungs, observing with quiet wonder the slow bending of flowers as the light faded. She felt close to God in those moments, though she did not name it. It was simply the feeling that something larger, something loving, held her small world together. But childhood, even one touched by grace, cannot stay untouched forever. As adolescence approached, Jane began to notice the invisible lines of expectation drawn around her as a young noblewoman. Her days remained peaceful, but the world was preparing to ask more of her. Responsibility, propriety, and eventually marriage. Though still young, she sensed that her life would not be entirely her own, that the path laid for her would require a mixture of obedience and courage. Yet she did not resist these expectations. Her father's example had taught her that duty, lived with honesty, can itself be a form of love. Still, somewhere quietly within her, a longing stirred. It was not yet the longing for religious life that would one day define her vocation, but rather a yearning for a life guided by purpose, shaped by God rather than circumstance. This longing was soft, like the faint scent of a flower carried on the wind, something she noticed only in certain moments. Perhaps when she knelt to pray, perhaps when she paused at a window and watched the clouds drift slowly across the sky. Perhaps when the memory of her mother rose within her, reminding her of how brief and fragile life can be. There was one moment during her youth that remained with her, a moment that would echo gently throughout her life. One evening, alone in the chapel, she watched the small golden door of the tabernacle gleam in the candlelight. She wondered why her heart felt pulled toward it with such quiet intensity, as if an invisible thread connected her to that silent presence. She felt a mixture of comfort and awe, and though she could not understand the fullness of the feeling, she sensed in a deep way that God would one day ask something of her. Not yet, not soon, but someday. And when he did, she hoped she would recognize his voice. These early impressions, these small encounters with grace, these soft shadows of sorrow, formed the soil of her character. Childhood is not merely a season of innocence, it is the foundation of the soul's lifelong response to God. Jane's early years were not dramatic, not filled with extraordinary visions or miracle-laden stories. They were marked instead by the quiet shaping of a heart that learned early how to be receptive, how to endure loss, how to trust in a presence often felt but seldom seen. And perhaps that is why, later in life, when storms would gather around her, when grief would tear through her world, and when the cross would press heavily upon her shoulders, she would have the strength not to break. The seeds had been planted long before she understood what they would need to sustain. And so her story begins not with heroism or bold acts, but with the delicate formation of a spirit that God Himself was gently preparing. What unseen graces were already at work in her young heart, shaping her for all that would come. From the quiet soil of her childhood faith, where early sorrow mingled with gentle hope, Jane's life began to unfold into the early bloom of young womanhood, moving with the slow, natural rhythm of a soul being prepared for a journey she could not yet imagine. As Jane Frances stepped into adolescence, the world around her widened with new colors, new responsibilities, and the subtle tremors of expectation that followed every young woman of noble birth. Burgundy itself seemed to grow larger in her eyes, no longer just the familiar courts and gardens of her childhood home, but a place of conversations, alliances, and the intricate patterns of life that shaped the families of influence. Yet even as she matured into the grace and presence of a noble young woman, Jane carried within her the soft imprint of her early contemplative heart. She moved through the corridors of her father's house with a quiet attentiveness, already forming habits of patience, modesty, and deep listening that were unusual in one so young. Her father often looked at her with a kind of reverence, sensing that the designs God held for his daughter were deeper than anything he could plan or foresee. Her education, rare in its richness, shaped her into an intelligent and discerning young woman. She learned Scripture not as an academic exercise, but as nourishment for the soul. She learned the Catechism with clarity, but she also absorbed its meaning with tenderness. Her father encouraged her to read widely, to think deeply, to cultivate not only manners but conscience. She learned to sew and manage a household, but she also learned how to pray with intention, how to meditate in silence, and how to carry both sorrow and gratitude with equal gentleness. These were traits that would later define her sanctity, though neither she nor anyone else could yet foresee the extraordinary path before her. As Jane came of age, those around her noticed her natural poise. She had a quiet beauty, the kind that did not call attention to itself, yet drew the eye because of its sincerity. People often described her as serene, composed, and deeply thoughtful. Her manners were refined, and her presence soothed the atmosphere of any gathering. But what made her most remarkable was not her outward grace. It was the way she made others feel understood, the way she seemed always to see to the heart of a person. Even in youth, Jane possessed a gift for compassion, for entering into the joys and sorrows of others without judgment. In a time when society expected noble women to shine through display and charm, Jane's radiance came instead from interior quiet, from a depth that made her stand out without ever trying to do so. Yet even as her virtues grew, so did the delicate tension between her own interior longing and the expectations laid upon her. She knew that marriage would be part of her future. She knew that, as a woman of rank, her life would be shaped by alliances, responsibility, and the management of a household. But she also sensed, in a way that she could not articulate, that her heart belonged to something greater than the roles being prepared for her. She began to pray more fervently, asking God to guide her steps, to allow her to fulfill her duty, but also to remain faithful to the whisper she felt within her soul, a whisper calling her toward a deeper belonging. Evenings became moments of quiet discernment. She often spent time in the family chapel after everyone else had retired, kneeling in the soft candlelight before the tabernacle. There, she let her heart rest in the stillness that seemed to emanate from the presence hidden behind the small golden door. Sometimes she prayed for her family, sometimes for the future husband she had not yet met. But often she simply sat in silence, allowing God to draw near in the darkness. These moments formed her interior life, strengthening the roots of her faith and preparing her for the trials she did not yet know were coming. Her father, watching her with both pride and tenderness, began to consider potential suitors. In 16th century France, marriage was both a personal and social matter, and as a respected nobleman, he took care to choose wisely. Suitors came with flattering words and promises, impressed by Jane's beauty and demeanor. Yet Jane herself remained reserved, discerning, and deeply prayerful. She did not wish to disappoint her father, nor did she wish to resist God's will. Her hope was simple, that the path God laid before her would also bring her peace. There was an evening during these years that remained engraved in her memory. She had wandered into the garden at dusk, a place where she often retreated for reflection. The sky was fading to soft rose and deepening blue, and the first stars appeared like scattered pearls above her. She felt a sudden, quiet certainty that God had woven something particular into her life, a purpose she could not yet name. She lifted her gaze to the sky, her hands clasped gently before her, and whispered a prayer. "Make me faithful wherever you lead me." That moment did not bring answers, but it brought a sense of trust, a soft assurance that God was guiding her even in uncertainty. And soon, a path would begin to appear. Among the suitors introduced to her father, one stood apart, Baron Christophe de Chantal, a young nobleman of integrity, kindness, and sincere virtue. Jane met him with the same composure she showed all others, but something within her recognized a harmony in their characters. They shared a similar seriousness of faith, a similar sense of responsibility, and an honest appreciation for truth and goodness. There was no dramatic moment of revelation, no passionate thunderbolt of emotion, only a gentle, steady recognition that this was the man with whom she could build a life of love, duty, and faithfulness. Their courtship was quiet but sincere, built on mutual respect, and marked by a natural ease that soothed Jane's uncertainties. With time, she grew to trust that this union was indeed God's answer to her prayers, a calling not to the cloister, but to the marriage bond, through which she would learn the depths of love, sacrifice, and perseverance. Her father, seeing her happiness, gave his blessing with heartfelt joy. The arrangements were made, and the future began to take shape before her. On the eve of her wedding, Jane returned once more to the family chapel. The candles flickered softly, casting warm light upon her folded hands. She prayed not for wealth or prestige, but for the grace to be a faithful wife, a loving mother, and a servant of God in all she did. She did not know the storms that awaited her, nor the sorrows that would one day shatter her heart. But in that moment, she offered her life to God with the quiet courage that would define her entire journey. And so, as she prepared to leave her father's house and step into the new life that awaited her, she carried with her the gentle shaping of her youth, the early loss, the soft longing for God, the finely cultivated virtues, and the silent promise she had made, to be faithful, whatever path he chose. What unseen graces were beginning to unfold as she entered marriage, not yet knowing the joys or the sorrows that would carve her heart more deeply than she could imagine? And so, from the gentle unfolding of her youth and the quiet certainty that settled into her heart on the eve of her wedding, we follow Jane now into the tender, hopeful years of early marriage, where love, responsibility, and vulnerability would begin weaving themselves into the fabric of her life. Jane's marriage to Baron Christophe de Chantal marked the beginning of a new season, one filled with the soft promise of companionship, shared purpose, and the ordinary joys of building a household rooted in mutual respect. Their union was not one of worldly extravagance or restless ambition, but of sincerity and warmth. Baron de Chantal, though noble and skilled in the duties of his estate, was above all a man of integrity, with a steady heart and a gentle manner that complemented Jane's own disposition. Their personalities aligned like two quiet melodies, rising together into harmony, forming a marriage marked by peace, affection, and a deep sense of partnership. In the grand halls and sunlit courtyards of their estate, Jane found herself not only respected, but genuinely cherished. Their early years together unfolded with the rhythm of simple joys and shared responsibilities. Jane managed the household with both grace and competence, ensuring that the servants were treated with respect, the accounts kept in order, and the atmosphere of home remained welcoming to visitors and family. She learned quickly how to balance the demands of nobility with her desire for humility, often leading by example in small acts of kindness. It was not uncommon to see her quietly assisting in tasks others might have considered beneath her station, her presence transforming daily labor into an offering of love. Christophe admired her deeply for this, often remarking that her gentleness made their home feel like a sanctuary. Motherhood soon entered her life, with its mix of joy and solemn responsibility. Jane gave birth to several children, and with each one she discovered a new depth of love. Love that expanded her heart until it seemed capable of holding the whole world. She prayed over the cradles of her newborns, asking God to protect them, to guide them, to shape their lives according to His wisdom. The first time she held her eldest son, she felt as if the world had shifted, its center now found in the small, breathing miracle resting in her arms. With each child, she grew in patience, tenderness, and courage. Yet motherhood also introduced her to a new vulnerability, the constant fear of sickness, the weight of responsibility, the aching awareness that life is fragile and unpredictable. Life in the Chantal household wasn't free from sorrow. Jane experienced loss among her children, mourning little ones who did not survive infancy. Her heart, though strengthened by faith, felt the piercing grief that only a mother can know. She wept quietly, leaning on Christophe for strength, turning to prayer for comfort, asking God why some flowers are allowed to bloom so briefly before they are gathered. These tears, though unseen by many, softened her soul, teaching her the sacred language of surrender that she would one day speak fluently. Despite these sorrows, the love between Jane and Christophe deepened. They supported one another in trials, celebrated small joys, and found in each other a source of calm in the midst of the uncertainties of their time. They lived in an era marked by tension and conflict throughout France, yet their home remained a refuge where faith guided decisions and charity shaped relationships. Evenings often ended with quiet conversation, reflections on the day, or simple shared silence that spoke of the trust and peace between them. Jane often thanked God for the grace of such a companion, believing that her marriage was not merely a duty fulfilled, but a blessing received. Christophe, recognizing Jane's wisdom and steadiness, often sought her counsel in managing the estate. He trusted her judgment, admired her insight, and relied on her ability to mediate conflicts with fairness and compassion. In turn, she encouraged him in generosity, urging him to treat tenants with understanding, to offer help to the poor, to live nobly not only in name, but in deed. Together they formed a partnership that bore the quiet beauty of mutual devotion. Yet, even in these peaceful years, subtle shadows began to form at the edges of their life. Christophe, though strong and capable, faced pressures as the head of a noble household, financial responsibilities, disputes among tenants, concerns over political unrest. At times, Jane sensed in him a weariness he tried to hide. She responded with deeper care, offering encouragement, managing more of the household burdens, and praying for him with a tenderness that sprang from both love and foresight. She had learned as a child that suffering often enters without warning, and she sought to prepare her heart to meet whatever cross might one day be laid upon her. There was a moment, seemingly small, that foreshadowed the fragility of their serene life. One afternoon, Christophe suffered a sudden fall from his horse. Though he recovered, the incident left an unease lingering in Jane's heart, a quiet intuition that their life, so delicately balanced, could change with a single breath. She prayed more fervently after this, asking God to give her the grace to remain strong, to be whatever her husband and children needed her to be. She did not yet know how prophetic her prayer would become. Still, she savored their daily joys, embracing the sweetness of family life with gratitude. She delighted in watching her children play in the gardens, in preparing them for their lessons, in nurturing their growing personalities. She cherished the moments when Christophe returned from his duties and lifted their little ones into his arms. She treasured the laughter, the shared meals, the steady pulse of ordinary love that filled their home. All of these memories, ordinary yet precious, would one day become the treasures she held close when sorrow would threaten to crush her. In these years, Jane's spiritual life deepened with a quiet intensity. She maintained her devotion to the Eucharist, found solace in the Psalms, and continued to seek God in the smallness of daily routine. She often reflected that holiness is not found in extraordinary deeds, but in the faithful offering of ordinary tasks. She believed that God dwelled in the simple things: folded linens, prepared meals, corrected children, and tender gestures of affection. And this conviction shaped her into a woman whose holiness rested upon humility and constancy. But life, especially for those marked by God for a special purpose, does not remain tranquil indefinitely. God had begun planting in her soul the seeds of a vocation that would one day stretch far beyond marriage and motherhood, though she could not yet perceive it. Her heart was being formed through love and responsibility, through joy and sorrow, through vulnerability and strength. And slowly, quietly, the cross was drawing nearer. For now her marriage remained her world, a world of warmth, duty, and tender companionship. She was grateful for it, unaware that every moment with her beloved husband, every shared glance, every comforting word, every ordinary joy, was a thread being woven into a tapestry that would soon be pierced by a grief so profound it would change the entire direction of her life. What unseen lessons were these early years writing into her heart, preparing her for the moment when love would be tested by a tragedy she could never have foreseen. And so, from the tender harmony of her early married years, shaped by love's gentle constancy and the steady unfolding of family life, we step quietly into the part of her journey where joy and fragility move side by side, preparing her heart for a sorrow that would one day strike with wrenching force. Life at Borbely seemed, for a time, to possess a warmth that felt almost timeless. Each morning, the sun rose over the fields and cast long golden threads across the estate, awakening a home where peace and responsibility blended into a rhythm Jane had learned to cherish. Her days began early. She oversaw the household, tended to the needs of her children, and worked alongside her servants with a humility that endeared her to everyone. She had the rare gift of making the simplest tasks feel sacred, infusing every action, whether nursing an infant, managing provisions, or welcoming guests, with a spirit of quiet devotion. Those who visited the Chantal household often carried away a distinct impression that its mistress radiated a calm presence capable of soothing both restlessness and sorrow. Christophe continued to admire his wife with affection and gratitude. Their relationship deepened not through dramatic gestures, but through the daily exchange of kindness. He confided in her his concerns about the estate and the turbulent political climate beyond their lands, and she listened with tenderness, offering advice when needed and prayer always. She found a certain fulfillment in the balanced partnership they shared, knowing that their union rested on a foundation of genuine respect. They seemed, in the eyes of many, to embody the ideal marriage, one in which two souls grow together toward virtue. Motherhood, too, continued shaping Jane's heart. Each child who was placed in her arms awakened new depths of tenderness within her. She delighted in their early steps, their unsteady little voices, their laughter echoing through the halls. Yet motherhood was never untouched by fear. Illness passed often through noble households, and each fever brought nights of vigil where Jane prayed at her children's bedsides, whispering the names of saints and invoking the mercy of God. She held her little ones with a blend of strength and vulnerability, aware that all life rests within God's hands. She mourned deeply the children she lost, holding their memories as small, fragile lights within her heart. She learned then that love always bears the risk of sorrow, and that sorrow, if offered to God, becomes a kind of love in return. Her sense of responsibility broadened as she grew into the role of baroness. She became known among the poor of the region for her generosity. She visited sick villagers, bringing bread, medicine, and compassionate listening. She offered comfort to grieving mothers, prayed with widows, and pursued justice for tenants in times of hardship. Her example softened even the sternest hearts. Those under the care of the Chantal estate often said that the lady brought not simply aid, but dignity, treating everyone she encountered as though Christ himself stood before her. This charity did not come from wealth alone. It flowed from a heart trained in tenderness from childhood, strengthened through personal loss, and nourished by faith. Still, as the years passed, shadows began to gather quietly around the Chantal household. Christophe, though still vigorous, showed signs of the burdens he carried. The responsibilities of managing land and navigating the uncertainties of the time weighed heavily on him. There were disputes with neighboring landowners, tensions arising from shifting politics, and financial pressures that demanded relentless effort. Jane noticed the fatigue that seemed to deepen in his eyes, the way he sometimes paused during their conversations, as if searching for strength. She responded with deeper care, lightening his load where she could, and offering him words of gentle encouragement. One particular moment during these years remained etched in her memory. Christophe had returned late one evening after helping to settle a difficult matter involving a violent disagreement among tenants. He entered the house weary, the weight of the situation hanging visibly upon him. Jane met him at the door, seeing at once that something within him needed shelter. She said nothing, but gently placed her hand upon his arm and led him to the small chapel within their home. There, before the faint glow of the sanctuary lamp, she knelt beside him. Together, without speaking, they offered their concerns to God, trusting that he saw them even when they did not understand his ways. That night, Jane felt more deeply than ever that marriage was a shared carrying of burdens, a mutual offering that allowed love to deepen even in silence. In those years, the bond between them grew more resilient, shaped not only by affection, but by shared vulnerability. This intimacy, tender and steady, became the anchor of their life. Jane often reflected that God had blessed her with a husband who was a companion for both joy and trial. She treasured their partnership with a gratitude that seemed to expand with each passing season. Little did she realize how fragile this gift truly was, and how soon it would be placed upon the altar of sacrifice. The tragedy that would change everything began as an ordinary event. Christophe was invited to join friends on a hunting expedition, a common pastime among noblemen. Jane felt a flicker of unease as he prepared to leave, not because of any visible danger, but because her heart sensed a subtle tremor, a shadow she could not name. She kissed him goodbye with unusual hesitation, though she hid her concern behind a gentle smile. Christophe, noticing her quietness, reassured her that he would return by evening. She watched him ride away, his figure diminishing along the path, and whispered a prayer that God would watch over him. As the day unfolded, she busied herself with household tasks, tending to her children and managing affairs. But the unease did not leave her. She paused frequently, lifting her heart to God in silent plea. Late afternoon stretched into early evening, and still he did not return. A strange stillness settled over her, the kind that descends before a storm breaks. And then, as the light faded, word arrived. An accident, a musket discharged unexpectedly, a serious injury. Christophe had been struck. The world seemed to tilt beneath her as she made her way to the place where he lay. When she reached him, she found her beloved husband suffering from a wound that would soon prove fatal. She knelt beside him, her heart breaking, her hands trembling as she tried to offer comfort. He looked at her with tenderness, his eyes filled with both pain and consolation. There, in those final hours, they spoke softly, not of fear, but of forgiveness, of love, of trust in God's mercy. Jane held his hand, her tears falling, yet her voice steady with faith. The moment he breathed his last, something within her shattered, a quiet collapse of the world she had known. And so widowhood entered her life, not gently, but like a storm breaking upon a fragile shore. She felt as though her heart had been torn open, leaving her exposed to a grief so vast that it threatened to swallow every ounce of strength she possessed. Yet at the very center of her sorrow, she sensed God's presence, faint but unyielding, calling her to lean upon him as she never had before. What then would this loss carve into her soul? What strength could be born from such anguish? And how would this wound guide her toward the destiny God had quietly prepared? And from the moment her husband's final breath slipped into the stillness of that sorrowful evening, Jane stepped into a new and unfamiliar landscape, a world shaped not by the warm companionship of marriage, but by a grief so deep it seemed at times to swallow the very light around her. Now her path unfolds into the long, shadowed valley of widowhood, where faith is tested, love is purified, and the first hints of a future calling begin to flicker faintly in the darkness. The days following Christophe's death unfolded with a heaviness that felt almost unbearable. The once lively halls of the Chantal estate, filled with the sounds of children, servants, and daily life, fell into an oppressive quiet. Every corner of the house reminded Jane of him. The chair where he used to sit after returning from the fields, the cloak hanging by the door, the small personal objects he touched every day. Even the echo of his footsteps seemed to linger in the memory of the walls. She moved through these familiar spaces like a figure displaced from her own life, caught between numbness and the sharp sting of loss that struck without warning. There were moments when she felt her knees give way beneath her, and she would press her hand against the nearest table or wall just to steady herself until the wave of sorrow passed. Yet in all her grief, she remained outwardly composed, especially for the sake of her children. She knew they needed her, and so she set aside her own anguish when their eyes turned toward her. She held them close, whispered words of comfort, and prayed with them, though inside her heart felt torn beyond repair. At night, when the household finally sank into silence and she was left alone, the weight of her widowhood descended fully. She knelt by her bed and laid her sorrow at the feet of God, often unable to form words, offering instead her tears as prayer. It was during these solitary vigils that she discovered a truth she had not known before, that grief, when placed in God's hands, becomes a kind of intimate dialogue, a trust deeper than anything spoken. One of the heaviest burdens she carried was her struggle with forgiveness. The man who had accidentally fired the shot that killed Christophe was devastated, overcome with guilt and remorse. Jane knew this, yet at first Her heart recoiled at the thought of him. Grief clouded her ability to see beyond the wound. Every time she heard his name, the image of her husband's final hours returned with crushing clarity. She felt anger rise within her like a bitter tide, an anger that frightened her because it was so unlike her natural temperament. But Jane was a woman shaped by grace. She refused to let this bitterness take root. She began to pray for the strength to forgive, even when she felt incapable of doing so. In time, through nights of wrestling with her own heart, forgiveness slowly emerged like a fragile bloom pushing through cold soil. The day she finally sent word of pardon to the man who had caused her such pain, she felt something within her unbind, as though God himself had lifted a stone from her chest. This act of mercy would mark the beginning of her spiritual transformation, though she did not yet understand its full significance. Widowhood brought not only emotional suffering but practical hardship as well. According to the customs of the time, Jane was required to move to the home of her father-in-law, a man whose temperament, though not cruel, was rigid and demanding. He expected obedience from those under his roof, and the sorrowing widow, now responsible for her children alone, was subject to his authority. This transition was painful for Jane, who had been mistress of her own home, respected and beloved. Yet she accepted her new circumstances with humility. She entered her father-in-law's household determined to bear her trials with patience, offering every discomfort, every misunderstanding, every stifled desire for independence as a quiet sacrifice to God. Life there was far from easy. Her father-in-law, grieving his son in his own manner, often projected his frustrations onto Jane. He criticized her decisions, questioned her choices, and imposed expectations that left her feeling constantly scrutinized. Jane, though gentle by nature, endured these hardships with a courage rooted in faith. She performed her duties with unwavering diligence, rising early to oversee the household, tending to her children with devotion, and navigating each day with a composure that belied her inner exhaustion. In many ways, these years were a crucible in which her soul was silently purified, prepared for a future she could not yet imagine. During these difficult days, Jane clung to prayer as her lifeline. She found solace in Scripture, drawing strength from the Psalms, which spoke directly to the depths of her sorrow. She attended Mass as often as possible, her eyes often filled with tears during the consecration, when she felt closest to the presence that held her together. It was in these moments before the Eucharist that she found courage for each new day. She would whisper quietly, "Lord, I am yours. Do with me what you will." That prayer, born of suffering, would become the foundation of the life God was slowly shaping within her. And yet, even as she sought God in her widowhood, there were moments when she felt lost, moments when the path forward seemed obscured by fog, when she questioned how she would raise her children, manage her responsibilities, or find meaning beyond the confines of her duties. But in the depths of this uncertainty, something began to stir. A longing, faint at first, then slowly growing. She felt drawn to a deeper spiritual life, to something beyond the routines that had defined her existence. She could not articulate this longing, yet it pressed against her heart like a quiet knocking, asking to be heard. It was during this period of interior searching that God began preparing the next chapter of her life. In her prayer, she sensed that her soul was being guided, though the direction remained hidden. She felt an unexplainable desire for a more complete abandonment to God, as though the loss of her husband had carved out within her a vast empty space meant to be filled by divine grace. She did not know yet how or where God intended to lead her, but she began asking with increasing sincerity, "Lord, show me the way." One night, overwhelmed by the weight of her responsibilities and the ache of her loneliness, she slipped away to the small chapel within her father-in-law's home. Kneeling in the dim candlelight, she let the tears fall freely. She felt her heart breaking open, her strength failing, her future uncertain. She whispered through trembling lips, "Where do you want me to go?" It was a question posed not in despair, but in surrender, a plea born from the depths of a soul ready to follow God into whatever unknown lay ahead. The answer did not come that night. It would come later, at a moment she could never have anticipated, through a meeting ordained by grace. But already the ground of her heart was being tilled, prepared to receive the seed of a vocation that would transform the course of her life and, through her, countless others. For now, she endured, she prayed, she served, she waited. And in that quiet waiting, in the heart of her grief and the heaviness of her daily burdens, the first whispers of a calling, one that would one day reshape the very map of her soul, began to stir faintly in the silence. What unseen providence was already moving toward her, preparing to introduce her to the man whose guidance would forever alter the direction of her life? And so, from the long silence of widowhood, where grief pressed heavily and prayer became her only refuge, we move now towards the moment when God would at last send an answer to her whispered question, a meeting that would not simply comfort her sorrow, but redirect the entire course of her life with a clarity she had never known before. For several years after Christophe's death, Jane lived under the roof of her father-in-law, carrying out her duties with patience and obedience, while her heart continued to search for a deeper purpose. The household remained a place of constant tension for her, a place where her devotion was not always understood, where her decisions were scrutinized, and where her grief, though softened with time, was not allowed to fully heal. Her father-in-law had grown dependent on her presence, relying on her for the management of domestic needs, for the comfort of familiar order, for the steadying influence she seemed to bring without effort. He was a man who valued control above affection, and though he bore her no ill will, he expected submission to his authority in every matter. Jane accepted this with grace, doing what she believed God asked of her for the sake of charity. But interiorly she longed for spiritual nourishment, for companionship of the soul, for someone who could guide her through the wilderness of her widowhood. Her children, now growing older, became both her consolation and her responsibility. She prayed for them constantly, mindful that the world would one day demand much of each. Her eldest, Cels Benigna, had inherited both his father's spirited nature and the impulsiveness that sometimes led him into trouble. Her daughters, delicate and attentive, mirrored her gentleness but were vulnerable to the influence of the household's strict atmosphere. Each one of her children awakened within her a mixture of joy and anxiety, and she carried their futures in her heart like fragile treasures entrusted to her care. Yet even motherhood, with all its demands, could not still the deeper stirring within her, the quiet longing for spiritual direction that had grown steadily stronger since her husband's death. It was in this period of uncertainty that God wove into her life a thread of grace so subtle at first that she barely recognized it. In the year 1604, while visiting Dijon, Jane heard that a renowned bishop, Frances de Sales, the Bishop of Geneva, was preaching a Lenten series in the city. His reputation for holiness had already spread throughout France. People spoke of him with reverence, a man of profound gentleness, clarity of heart, and wisdom capable of touching souls at their deepest points. His preaching, they said, had the power to awaken faith in those who listened. Some described him as a spiritual physician whose words healed wounds long hidden. Others remarked that his voice carried a peace that few men possessed. Jane, though occupied by many responsibilities, felt an unusual impulse to attend one of his sermons. It was not curiosity that drew her. Something in her heart responded to his name, as though God himself had quietly arranged the meeting. The church that day was filled with an expectant hush, the kind that settles when people know they are in the presence of someone extraordinary. When Frances began to speak, Jane felt immediately as though a veil had been lifted from her understanding. His words were simple, yet they carried a depth that seemed to mirror the very movement of her own soul. He spoke of surrender, of divine love, of trusting God's will without resistance, of the patience required to endure sorrows without losing peace. He spoke not as one removed from suffering, but as someone who understood its hidden contours. His voice did not stir dramatic emotion. Rather, it called forth a quiet recognition, a sense of having found, perhaps for the first time, a language for the longing she had carried for so many years. Jane listened with an attention so complete that the rest of the church seemed to fade from her awareness. His words seemed addressed directly to her, touching precisely the places in her heart still marked by grief, confusion, and yearning. She felt a calm descend upon her, a calm she had not known since before Christophe's death, and a certainty formed within her that God, through this gentle bishop, was offering her the guidance she had prayed for in the dark nights of her widowhood. After Mass, she approached him, nervous but compelled by an inner push she could not ignore. The moment their eyes met, Frances de Chantal perceived something in her soul that startled him. Later, he would write that he recognized in her a purity of intention, a capacity for holiness, a depth of suffering transformed into openness that made him understand instantly that God intended him to guide her. But in that moment, he offered her nothing dramatic. Instead, he greeted her with a simple kindness, asking her about her family, her life, her burdens. Jane, who had never been one to reveal her heart easily, found herself speaking with an honesty that surprised even her. The bishop listened, not impatiently, not distractedly, but with a focused gentleness that made her feel truly seen. He did not offer immediate solutions to her grief. Rather, he spoke of trust, of waiting upon God, of letting suffering shape rather than destroy the heart. He encouraged her to be faithful in her duties, to anchor herself in prayer, and to resist the discouragement that often tempted widows into despair. He asked her to reflect on her spiritual desires, not with haste, but with calm discernment. He reminded her that God works in silence, and that the greatest transformations often begin with the smallest seeds. From that day forward, their spiritual friendship began, one of the most beautiful and fruitful relationships in the history of the Church. Frances agreed to guide her soul, and Jane, recognizing his gentle authority as God's answer to her long-held plea, entrusted herself to his direction with total sincerity. Their conversations became the balm she had needed for so long. He helped her see that her sorrow, far from being a punishment, had opened her heart to receive God's love more fully. He taught her that holiness is not found in outward gestures, but in interior freedom, in placing one's will entirely into God's hands. He helped her learn how to pray through suffering, how to embrace the present moment, and how to discern God's voice amidst the noise of daily life. The more they spoke, the more clearly Jane began to understand a new truth awakening within her, that God might be calling her not just to endure her widowhood, but to allow it to become the birthplace of something greater. She could not yet see the shape of this calling, only that her heart was slowly turning toward a horizon she had never before considered. Frances perceived this too. He sensed in her the potential for a vocation far beyond the ordinary path of widowhood. But he did not rush her. He knew that God unfolds his designs slowly, gently, according to the readiness of the soul. And so, under the guidance of this remarkable bishop, Jane's interior world began to bloom with a clarity she had not known since childhood. The grief that once threatened to crush her became, under his direction, the soil in which God would plant the first seeds of her future mission. What shape would this mission take? And how would this unexpected friendship guide her toward a vocation that would demand everything she had ever held dear? And from that first meeting, so gentle yet so decisive, the path before Jane slowly began to take form, as though a lantern had been lit in the dim corridors of her soul. With Frances de Sales now guiding her steps, she entered a season of discernment unlike anything she had known before, one marked by inner struggle, obedience, longing, and a deepening awareness that God was beginning to ask something of her that would stretch her heart far beyond its familiar bounds. In the months that followed their providential encounter, Jane's spiritual life blossomed with a new intensity. It was not the fervor of sudden conversion, nor the thrill of dramatic inspiration. Rather, it was the quiet, steady flowering of a soul finally receiving the nourishment it had been thirsting for. Under Frances's direction, she learned to listen more carefully to the movements of her heart, to distinguish between impulses born of grief and those born of grace, to recognize the voice of God not in thunder, but in gentle persistence. He encouraged her to begin each day with a moment of surrender, whispering simply, "Teach me, Lord, what you desire." This daily offering became the compass guiding her through the complexities of widowhood, responsibility, and spiritual longing. Frances's letters to her, filled with tenderness and wisdom, became her lifeline. He invited her to cultivate interior peace, reminding her that God does not dwell in agitation or restlessness. He taught her that true holiness often hides itself in ordinary duties, in patience during trials, in the small surrender of one's own will for the sake of charity. "Do everything gently," he told her, "with love, with patience, with a heart turned toward God." Jane absorbed these teachings with eagerness. She felt as though her heart, once weighed down by sorrow, was now being opened and reformed, stretched toward a new horizon where God waited to reveal his plan. Yet, as her spiritual life deepened, so did the conflict within her. She began to sense the first movements of a calling, a quiet but unmistakable desire to belong entirely to God. It rose within her like a tide, gentle yet persistent, urging her toward a life of deeper dedication, perhaps even religious life. These thoughts frightened her at first. She was still a mother, still bound by obligations to her children and her father-in-law. To leave them seemed unthinkable. And yet the longing did not fade. It grew stronger with each passing month, whispering to her in moments of prayer, echoing softly during quiet walks, surfacing in her heart even as she went about her daily tasks. Frances recognized this stirring in her long before she admitted it aloud. Through years of guiding souls, he had come to recognize the subtle signs of a vocation awakening. The restlessness of heart, the increasing hunger for God, the desire to escape worldly distractions, the deepening distaste for anything that did not lead to holiness. Still, he did not press her. True to his nature, he allowed God to work, gently directing her without forcing the direction. He knew that vocation cannot be imposed. It must be discovered through the free, deliberate opening of one's soul. And so he walked with her patiently, helping her navigate her fears, her doubts, and her responsibilities. One of the greatest obstacles for Jane was her children. Though she trusted God, she feared abandoning them at a vulnerable age. Her eldest son, spirited and impulsive, demanded constant guidance. Her daughters needed her affection and example. Her youngest still clung to her skirts with the helpless dependency of childhood. How could she leave them? How could God ask such a thing? These questions tore at her heart. At times she felt caught between two powerful loves, the love of her children and the love of God. Frances reassured her that God's plans never contradict the demands of charity, that any vocation meant for her would unfold in harmony with her duties rather than in opposition to them. But still, the internal struggle remained. Her father-in-law added weight to this struggle. Stern, possessive, and accustomed to her presence, he resisted any hint of change. He depended on her not only for the functioning of his household, but also for emotional stability. When he sensed her growing desire for spiritual withdrawal, he became anxious, fearing disruption to the life he had meticulously arranged. He did not understand the depths of her longing. He saw only the threat of losing the one person who had brought harmony to his home. His opposition, subtle at first, grew stronger as he realized the shifting contours of her heart. These pressures created within Jane an interior battlefield. Her prayer intensified. She spent long hours in the chapel, kneeling before the crucifix, asking for clarity, begging God to show her how to reconcile competing loyalties. Many nights she slept little, her heart weighed down by conflicting desires. The longing for a religious life did not feel like an escape. Rather, it felt like being drawn toward a truth she could not ignore. And yet the sense of duty toward her family pressed heavily upon her. She feared making a mistake. She feared hurting those she loved. She feared following her own will instead of God's. These fears, though painful, refined her soul, teaching her the humility necessary for true discernment. Francis, with his characteristic gentleness, guided her through these storms. He asked her to trust the slow work of grace. He reminded her that God often allows tension and confusion precisely so that the soul may deepen its surrender. He encouraged her to move forward, not with haste, but with patient fidelity, taking each step only when God illuminated it. Under his guidance, she learned to offer her fears to God, to release her need for control, and to trust that whatever path he asked her to walk would be accompanied by his grace. During this period of discernment, Jane made a silent retreat under Francis's direction, an experience that marked her profoundly. In the stillness of prayer, she began to understand that her heart wasn't meant to remain divided forever. She felt called to a deeper union with God, a union that no earthly attachment could fully satisfy. Yet she also sensed that this calling would not manifest immediately. God was still preparing her. The retreat clarified her longing, but did not answer all her questions. Rather, it awakened within her a readiness, a willingness to follow wherever God would eventually lead. One afternoon, after returning from the retreat, she walked alone in the gardens, feeling the air shift around her, carrying with it the early signs of autumn. Leaves moved gently across the ground, whispering of change. She paused beneath a tree, her hands folded before her, and allowed herself to acknowledge, without fear, the truth her heart had been circling for months. God was calling her to something more. Not simply to endure, not simply to serve in her present circumstance, but to open herself to a vocation that would require her whole self. She did not yet know what form it would take: religious life, founding a community, or something else entirely. But she felt its certainty. And with that certainty came both peace and trembling. Francis, when she shared this realization with him, responded not with surprise, but with a serene affirmation. He told her that God had indeed planted a seed of grace within her soul, and that one day, when the moment was right, that seed would blossom into a mission unlike any she had imagined. But he also told her to wait, to remain patient, to let God reveal his plan in his time, not hers. He knew she was not yet free, emotionally, materially, or spiritually, to step into the calling she sensed. Still, he reassured her that the desire itself was a sign of God's presence, a gentle promise of what would come. And so Jane continued living her daily life, raising her children, managing her responsibilities, enduring her father-in-law's demands, while nurturing in her heart the quiet flame of her growing vocation. She did not try to force it into clarity. She simply held it before God, trusting that he would guide each step when the hour came. But every promise of God eventually meets a moment of decision. Every longing eventually asks to be answered. And soon, Jane would be asked to choose, not in haste, not against charity, but with the courageous honesty of a soul ready to offer everything. When that moment arrived, what would she do? And how would her obedience, born in the crucible of struggle, open the door to a mission that would change the spiritual landscape of an entire century? And so, as the quiet fire of vocation continued its slow, insistent burning within her, Jane found herself standing before the threshold of a choice, one that would not be made in a single dramatic moment, but through a series of tender, painful surrenders. Now her life begins moving toward the decisive act that will draw her permanently into the path God has been preparing since childhood, even as the world around her tightens its hold and demands she remain where she has always been. The months that followed her deepening discernment were marked by a constant interior tension, the kind that stretches a soul in opposite directions. On one side, the unmistakable pull of God drew her toward a life of deeper consecration, a vocation awakening with such persistence that to ignore it felt impossible. On the other side, love and duty bound her to her family, her children, still young and in need of their mother, and her aging father-in-law, who relied on her presence not only for practical management, but for emotional stability. Jane lived suspended between these two worlds, feeling her heart slowly torn open as she tried to discern God's design in the midst of conflicting demands. Her spiritual correspondence with Frances de Sales became more essential than ever. He, with his remarkable insight and gentleness, guided her through the layers of fear and desire that mingled within her. He reminded her often that God's will is never opposed to charity, that any vocation must be pursued with an unwavering regard for those entrusted to us. He did not press her to choose, nor did he shield her from the weight of the decision. Instead, he accompanied her with the calm assurance of a man who understood that holiness is not born from ease, but from fidelity within struggle. Her children were her primary sorrow in this discernment. Each of them reflected a facet of her heart, and she could not imagine abandoning them. Her eldest son, spirited and restless, required guidance to prevent him from drifting into disorderly habits. Her daughters, tender and impressionable, looked to her for example and security. The youngest still clung to her hand with the innocent dependency of childhood. Jane loved them not with a passing affection, but with the depth of a mother whose heart had been formed through both joy and sorrow. She feared that following her vocation would wound them or leave them adrift. Yet she also feared that resisting God's call would leave her unable to guide them with the integrity they deserved. Meanwhile, her father-in-law's resistance grew increasingly pronounced. He sensed the shift within her, the way her eyes lingered longer in prayer, the way her conversations reflected a deeper interiority, the way a subtle lightness began to replace the heaviness she had carried since her husband's death. His fear was not theological, but practical. He could not bear the thought of losing the daughter-in-law who had given structure to his household and soothing presence to his old age. He depended on her in ways he did not admit, and her desire to leave felt to him like betrayal. When the possibility of her religious calling began to surface, he responded not with gentle persuasion, but with bitterness, insistence, and emotional pressure. His disapproval pressed upon Jane with the weight of guilt. She did not wish to cause pain. She did not wish to disrupt the fragile peace that had settled upon the household. She did not wish to seem ungrateful for the roof he had provided her after Christophe's death. And yet, deep within her, the sense of God's invitation grew stronger each day, like a quiet knocking she could no longer pretend not to hear. As the interior battle intensified, Jane began to experience a new kind of spiritual suffering, the fear of deceiving herself. She questioned whether her desire for religious life was truly from God or merely a response to the suffering she had endured. She examined her heart with sincerity, bringing every thought to prayer, allowing Francis to guide her through each fear with clarity. He reassured her that time would reveal the truth, that genuine vocation is tested in the crucible of doubt, and that the soul must learn to distinguish between the fleeting impulses of emotion and the enduring movements of grace. Yet the struggle remained. At times, she pleaded with God to remove the longing if it were not His will. At other times, she felt her heart expand with a joy so profound at the thought of giving herself entirely to Him that she could not imagine any other future. This fluctuation, though painful, refined her desire, teaching her to surrender not only her actions but her very will. During this period, Jane found herself drawn more deeply into prayer than ever before. She would rise in the early hours of the morning, before the household stirred, and slip quietly into the chapel. There, in the presence of the Eucharist, she allowed her soul to rest, to breathe, to cry, to plead, to hope. She felt at times as though she stood on the edge of a vast, uncharted horizon, unable to see what lay beyond, but knowing with certainty that God was there, waiting. It was in one of these early morning vigils that the first clear light began to dawn. As she knelt in the stillness, overwhelmed by the weight of her confusion, she suddenly felt a peace descend upon her, a peace unlike anything she had known. It did not erase her sorrow or resolve her responsibilities, but it washed through her heart with a gentle authority, assuring her that God would take care of what she could not. She realized then that her vocation, whatever form it would ultimately take, would not be built upon abandoning her duties, but upon offering them to God in a new and radical way. She sensed that her calling was not to escape her life, but to allow God to transform it. Around this time, she experienced a profound moment of clarity when Francis invited her to reflect on the nature of God's love. He wrote to her, "God desires your heart, not to tear it apart, but to fill it with Himself. He takes nothing from us without intending to give infinitely more." These words pierced her soul. She realized that her hesitation came not from lack of love for God, but from fear of losing what she held dear. Yet Francis's words revealed the deeper truth. God never asks for a sacrifice without intending to pour grace upon the wound it leaves. Still, she faced the practical impossibility of leaving her children in her father-in-law's household, especially her daughters, who required protection and guidance. Providence intervened through the generous offer of her father, President Fremyot, who invited her to return to his home with her children. This invitation, though simple, reshaped the entire landscape of her discernment. It freed her from the oppressive environment of her father-in-law's home, allowed her children to be raised in a place of love and integrity, and removed a barrier that had long held her heart captive. When she moved back to her father's household, the atmosphere of freedom allowed her vocation to unfold more naturally. Surrounded by affection, supported by a man who respected her conscience, and guided with unmatched gentleness by Frances, she felt her heart settling into a clarity she had not experienced before. The longing for a deeper consecration to God intensified, not as escape, not as reaction, but as the fruit of grace. One evening, while praying in the quiet sanctuary of her father's home, she realized with unmistakable certainty that God was calling her to leave the world, to enter religious life, and to dedicate the rest of her days to Him. She felt a profound peace settle over her, the kind that comes not from emotion but from obedience to truth. Her tears flowed, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. The decision she had feared, questioned, and resisted had finally become the doorway into the freedom she had waited for since her earliest prayers. Yet the path ahead would not be simple. Resistance would come from family. Pain would accompany every step, and the sacrifice required of her would test the very limits of her endurance. But the decision had been made, not in haste, not in self-will, but in the quiet, courageous surrender of a soul ready to give God everything He asked. What trials would arise now that she had chosen her path? How would she step into the unknown future God had prepared, a future that would require a farewell deeper than any she had ever made? And so, with her heart finally bowed in obedience to the gentle insistence of grace, Jane stepped toward the moment she had long feared and long awaited, a moment when the quiet, interior decision would need to take shape in the visible world. Now begins the tender, wrenching passage through which she must leave behind everything familiar so that God's plan may at last come into view, though it will cost her a farewell deeper than anything she has ever known. When Jane finally admitted to herself and to God that He was calling her to religious life, the realization brought not triumph, but trembling humility. She knew the decision wasn't hers alone to live. It would alter the lives of her children, unsettle her family, and invite the criticism of those who could not understand the movements of grace within a widow's heart. In the security of her father's home, she prayed for courage. Courage not merely to follow her vocation, but to endure the pain that fidelity would inevitably inflict upon others. Her father, President Fremyot, received her confession with a tenderness that both relieved and astonished her. He understood her longing, saw the sincerity of her devotion, and, unlike her father-in-law, offered no resistance. Instead, he assured her that God's will should never be hindered by human fear. His support was the first sign that Providence was clearing a path where none had seemed possible. Frances de Sales, upon hearing of her clarity, responded with a gentle joy. He had perceived for some time that God intended something exceptional through her, though He never imposed His intuition upon her discernment. Now, seeing that grace had ripened her soul to readiness, He began to guide her with more concrete direction. He spoke to her about a vision God had placed upon His own heart. A new religious institute characterized not by rigid penances or harsh austerities, but by humility, gentleness, and an openness to the frail and the vulnerable. A community where women who could not endure the more severe orders might still offer themselves wholly to God. A community where the virtues of the Virgin Mary, softness, simplicity, quiet strength, would form its foundation. It would be called the Order of the Visitation of Holy Mary. Jane listened with wonder, touched by the thought that God's plan for her was not simply to enter an existing order, but to help build a new one. Yet she asked no grand questions. She did not seek to know her role or significance. Her heart was focused on obedience alone. If God wished her to help form a community, she would do so. If he wished her simply to serve silently within it, she would do that as well. Her surrender was complete. Still, one great trial remained. She must leave her children. It was a moment she had dreaded since the first stirrings of vocation. Jane loved her children with a love as deep as breath, and the thought of parting from them felt like tearing life from her bones. She prayed over each of them in secret, asking God to fill the places where she could no longer remain. She trusted her father to guide them, yet the maternal instinct within her recoiled from the pain of separation. She asked Francis whether such a sacrifice was truly God's will. He reassured her gently that God himself would care for her children, that their futures rested more securely in his providence than in her hands, and that her fidelity to God would bring grace not only upon her, but upon her entire family. And so, with trembling courage, she prepared for the farewell. Her eldest son, spirited and proud, struggled to understand. He felt abandonment, fear, and confusion. Her daughters clung to her skirts, begging her not to leave. Jane knelt before them, gathering them into her arms, feeling their tears wet her face as she tried to whisper comfort into a wound she could not prevent. She reminded them that God would never be far from them, that she would pray for them daily, and that her love would follow them wherever they went. She tried to remain composed, but her heart cracked beneath the weight of their sobs. These moments, more than any physical suffering that would come later, became the greatest sacrifice of her life. After the farewell, when the door closed behind her for the final time, Jane felt as though her soul had been emptied. She knew that following God sometimes means walking with wounds that never fully heal. Yet she trusted, with a trust forged only through years of sorrow, that God would take her offering and transform it into something that would bear fruit beyond her imagination. On the appointed day, Jane left Dijon and made her way toward Annecy, the city where Frances de Sales resided, and where the first house of the new order would be established. She traveled with 2 companions who would join her, women whose own callings intertwined with hers, and together they carried modest belongings and hearts ready for the unknown. The road wound through forests and valleys, past rivers and villages, each mile taking her farther from everything she had known and deeper into the mystery God was unfolding. As she approached Annecy, a quiet peace settled upon her. The city, nestled between lake and mountain, seemed held in God's gentle hand. When she arrived at the modest house prepared for the foundation of the new order, she found Francis waiting for her. His face bore a serenity that confirmed all she had hoped. He welcomed her not as a noblewoman, not as a widow of rank, but as a daughter of God stepping into her vocation. The first days in the small house of the Visitation were marked by a humility so profound it startled even Jane. The building was poor, scarcely furnished, with bare walls and simple wooden floors. There were no grand cloisters, no ornate chapels, no luxuries of any kind. The air was cool and quiet, filled only with the sounds of prayer and the soft movement of Frances's gentle guidance. It was a beginning built on poverty, simplicity, and faith alone. Jane embraced this life with joy. She swept floors, prepared meals, washed linens, and prayed long hours beside her sisters. For a woman of her noble status, such tasks might have seemed humiliating, but to Jane, they were a freedom she had never known. She who had managed great estates and held positions of responsibility now found grace in the smallness of daily tasks. Her humility filled the house like a fragrance. She asked for no privileges, sought no positions. She wanted only to serve. Francis watched her with admiration. He saw in her the perfect embodiment of the spirit he envisioned for the visitation. Gentleness united with strength, humility joined with perseverance, charity expressed through every action. Under his direction, the order began to take shape. Prayer balanced with work, silence softened by kindness, discipline rooted not in harshness but in love. The first vows were made quietly, in a small chapel illumined by the faint glow of candles. When Jane knelt to offer herself entirely to God, she felt an interior light rise within her, a steady peace that told her she was exactly where God intended her to be. The years of grief, the long journey of discernment, the painful farewells, all had led her to this moment of complete surrender. And yet this beginning, beautiful as it was, would soon give way to trials that would test the endurance of the fledgling order and the depth of Jane's trust. For the world doesn't always welcome holiness, especially when it takes root in unexpected places. Poverty, instability, criticism, and misunderstanding would soon sweep across the quiet house of the Visitation. But for now, in this first embrace of her new life, Jane rested in the tender certainty that she had stepped into the heart of God's will. What storms would arise as the Visitation began to grow? And how would Jane's quiet strength guide the young order through its earliest, most fragile years? And so, from the humble wooden floors of that first little house in Annecy, where vows were whispered in quiet trust, and the earliest threads of a new order were woven with trembling hope, we follow Jane into the fragile beginnings of the Visitation. Years marked not by triumph or ease, but by poverty, misunderstanding, and the relentless trials through which God would purify both the foundress and the foundation she helped to build. The early days of the Visitation were unlike anything Jane had ever known. After years of the structured life of nobility and the heavy responsibilities of managing an estate, she now awoke each morning in a house where the only riches were silence and prayer, where nothing belonged to her, and where everything, every moment of work, every small sacrifice, every hidden act of love was offered directly to God. Poverty was not merely present, it was the very air they breathed. The few furnishings were rough and simple. The sisters slept on straw mattresses. Their clothing was plain, mended again and again until the fabric grew thin. They grew accustomed to the sound of wind seeping through the cracks of the windows in winter, and to the scarcity that marked every season. Yet in this poverty, Jane felt a strange and profound freedom. The weight that had pressed upon her for so many years lifted. Now she carried nothing but God's will. Still, poverty was not their greatest trial. The deeper difficulties came from outside, from family, society, and even the church, which did not always understand the new form of religious life Frances was trying to introduce. The Visitation was designed to be gentle, accessible to women who could not endure harsh penances, open to those of fragile health or advancing age. Their austerities, if they could be called such, were rooted in humility rather than physical rigor. Some believed this made the order lax. Others criticized its simplicity, insisting that true religious life must be marked by severe mortifications. Jane heard murmurs from those who doubted the community's seriousness, from priests who questioned Frances's innovation, and from relatives who believed that she, a woman of noble birth, had entered a life far beneath her dignity. These criticisms wounded her deeply. She had sacrificed everything, her children, her status, her comforts, not for novelty, but out of obedience to God, and to see her motives misunderstood was a suffering more piercing than hunger or cold. But Frances, with his characteristic calm, reassured her. "We must build on humility," he told her, "not on the judgments of men." His confidence steadied her, reminding her that true holiness is rarely recognized at first, and that new works of God often begin beneath clouds of suspicion. Within the house, the sisters themselves brought their own challenges. Religious life, even in its most gentle form, places souls of different temperaments, backgrounds, and wounds into close proximity. Some struggled with obedience, others wrestled with jealousy or insecurity. A few entered with a romanticized notion of religious life and quickly became discouraged when faced with the smallness of daily sacrifice. Jane, as their superior, bore the weight of their weaknesses as a mother bears the burdens of her children, not with impatience, but with a compassion that came from her own painful schooling in suffering. She learned to correct gently, to encourage quietly, to guide firmly when necessary, and always to see Christ beneath the frailties of each sister. These early conflicts purified her, teaching her that spiritual motherhood is as demanding as biological motherhood, though its pains are often hidden from sight. As the months passed, the visitation grew slowly but steadily. Women came, drawn by the order's spirit of humility and warmth. Some were widows like Jane, seeking refuge for their broken hearts. Others were young women longing for a life of prayer, but unable to bear the rigors of stricter orders. Still others arrived with fragile health, surprised to find that there was finally a community where weakness was not dismissed, but embraced as a path to God. Jane welcomed each of them with a tenderness that made them feel seen and safe. She understood, better than most, what it meant to arrive wounded. She knew how to hold space for sorrow without letting it suffocate hope. Under her guidance, the house became a refuge for souls wearied by the harshness of the world. Yet even as the order grew, trials continued to weave themselves into its foundation. The community endured seasons of food scarcity when donations were meager and crops failed. There were days when the sisters did not know how they would feed themselves, when they gathered in the chapel with empty hands and empty stomachs, asking God to provide. Jane learned to trust God with an immediacy she had not known before. She had once managed estates with abundance. Now she managed a household where every loaf of bread felt like a miracle. And yet, again and again, Providence intervened, sometimes through unexpected gifts, sometimes through anonymous benefactors, sometimes through the kindness of neighbors moved by the sisters' serenity in the face of need. These provisions strengthened their faith and rooted the visitation in a confidence that God never abandons those who trust Him. The greatest joy during these years was the continued companionship and guidance of Frances de Sales. He visited often, walking through the small rooms with a quiet smile, offering counsel, mediating conflicts, writing constitutions, and strengthening the sisters with his gentleness. His presence filled the house with peace. He and Jane worked side by side, not as co-founders seeking prestige, but as spiritual friends united by the same vision. They complemented each other beautifully. Frances with his serene wisdom, Jane with her practical strength and maternal intuition. Together they shaped the identity of the visitation, a place where hearts wounded by life might learn to rest in God. But this very closeness, the spiritual harmony between them, also drew criticism. There were whispers that their friendship was too affectionate, too intense, too central to the order. Jane suffered deeply from these rumors, not because they accused her of wrongdoing, but because they misrepresented the purity of a bond built entirely on God. Frances reassured her, reminding her that holy friendships are often misunderstood in a world that measures love by the wrong standards. Their friendship, far from being a distraction, was the soil from which the visitation grew, a friendship God Himself had orchestrated. Still, The rumors left their mark. They taught her that the path of holiness is inseparable from misunderstanding, that those who seek to follow God will often be judged by those who cannot see into the heart. She bore this suffering quietly, offering it to God as yet another hidden sacrifice, another stitch in the tapestry of grace He was weaving through her life. As the years passed, the visitation expanded beyond Annecy. New houses were founded, new sisters welcomed, and the order's gentle charism began to spread through France. Jane, once a widow lost in grief, now walked with the confidence of a woman who had found her place in God's plan. Her leadership, though humble, became a steady anchor for the sisters who looked to her for direction. She continued to perform the simplest tasks, sweeping, cooking, caring for the sick, never allowing her role as foundress to become a barrier between herself and those she served. And yet, just as the order reached a moment of stability and promise, life prepared to strike another blow, one that would cut straight into the heart of the visitation and test Jane's faith more deeply than any external trial. The one who had guided her, strengthened her, and walked beside her since the moment God began to call her would soon be taken from the world, leaving her to navigate the future without the gentle voice that had shaped her soul. How would she endure the loss of her spiritual father? And how would the visitation survive when its luminous shepherd no longer walked among them? And so, as the gentle order she helped nurture took its first steady breaths, and as the guiding presence of Frances de Sales continued to illuminate her path with paternal warmth, the season quietly approached when God would ask Jane to walk into a deeper solitude, a solitude shaped not by abandonment, but by a loss so profound it would hollow her heart, stretch her faith, and usher her into the most hidden chambers of surrender. The death of Frances de Sales did not fall upon the visitation like a sudden storm. It approached slowly, like a long twilight deepening into night. For months, Jane sensed that the bishop's strength was waning. His letters, once full of gentle playfulness, began to reveal a weariness between the lines. His visits to the monastery grew less frequent. His steps, once brisk, became more measured. Yet even in his frailty, he remained a beacon of serenity. He concealed his pain with a peace that seemed to rise from a place beyond the reach of suffering, offering encouragement to others, even as his own body weakened. Jane noticed every change. She had known him long enough and deeply enough to discern what others missed. She saw the way he steadied himself against a wall when he thought no one was looking. She noticed the moments when he paused more often during conversations, as though gathering strength. She felt the growing silence between his breaths, but she did not speak of it, for to name it felt like inviting sorrow too great to bear. Instead, she accompanied him with the quiet fidelity that had shaped their friendship from the beginning. Never dramatic, never demanding, simply present. When the final winter approached, Frances's health declined sharply. Word spread that he had traveled to Lyons but had fallen ill. The news reached Jane with a piercing clarity, as if the world had suddenly shrunk around her. She prayed for him night after night, kneeling before the tabernacle with tears that slipped down her cheeks in the long hours before dawn. She begged God not for miracles, but for mercy, for him, for the sisters, for herself. And then, in the last days of December 1622, the message arrived. Frances de Sales had returned his soul to God. The moment Jane heard the news, time seemed to dissolve into silence. She felt the world tilt beneath her, as though something foundational within her had given way. It was as if she had been walking along a sure path, and suddenly the ground had vanished. Her heart contracted in a grief unlike any she had known, not the grief of losing a husband, not even the anguish of leaving her children, but the grief of losing the spiritual companion whose guidance had become the compass of her soul. In him she had found not just a director, but a father in the most profound sense, a protector, a mentor, a friend whose presence had anchored her entire vocation. She was not allowed to collapse into this grief. There were sisters who looked to her for strength, who relied on her composure to understand their own sorrow. Jane knew she must carry the loss with dignity, but inside, her heart felt broken open. She tried to read Frances's letters and found herself weeping. She tried to pray and felt only silence. The God who had spoken so clearly through Frances now felt distant, hidden behind a veil of emptiness she could not penetrate. The days following his death unfolded in a haze of mourning. The community, shattered by the loss, clung to one another in prayer. Jane moved among the sisters with tenderness, offering comfort even while her own heart bled. She reminded them of Frances's teachings, his love, his wisdom. She encouraged them to trust that he remained with them in spirit. But late at night, when the monastery grew silent, she would enter the chapel alone and kneel in the darkness, her hands trembling as she tried to hold the weight of her sorrow. Frances's absence forced her into a solitude she had never before experienced. His voice, once so constant, was gone. His counsel, once so clear, could no longer be sought. In its place, she encountered only silence, vast, unyielding silence. And it was precisely within that silence that God began the most mysterious and difficult work of her life, the deepening of her faith beyond the support of human friendship. At first, the silence felt harsh. Jane found herself plagued by doubts she had not known before. How was she to lead the order without Frances's guidance? How could she remain faithful when the light that had illuminated her path had been extinguished? She feared making mistakes, feared misinterpreting God's will, feared failing the sisters entrusted to her. This fear pressed upon her with a weight so heavy she sometimes felt unable to breathe. Yet slowly, through that darkness, she discovered a truth that Frances had always taught her, but that she had never fully understood. God is most present precisely where he seems most absent. It is in the stripping away of every earthly support that the soul learns to lean fully upon him. Jane's faith, tested now by the loss of her spiritual father, began to take root in a deeper soil. It was not the consoling, luminous faith of her early years, but a faith forged in emptiness, a faith purified of sentiment, grounded entirely in trust. This transition was not swift. It unfolded over months and years. There were nights when she felt abandoned, when prayer brought no comfort, when the cross felt unbearably heavy. There were mornings when the ache of Frances's absence returned with fresh force, like a wound reopened. Yet every time she knelt before the tabernacle, she felt a faint warmth, just enough to stay faithful. It was the kind of grace that doesn't remove suffering, but transforms it from within, strengthening the soul without altering the pain. Her leadership, too, matured during this time. Without Frances's guidance, she had to rely on the lessons he had etched into her heart. She began to act with greater decisiveness, yet always with gentleness. She learned to trust the inspiration God placed within her. She realized that the order could not be built on one man's wisdom alone. It must grow through the cooperation of all its members, guided by the Holy Spirit. Her humility deepened, shaped now not by self-effacement, but by the profound recognition that God accomplishes his work through fragile instruments. In her grief, she wrote letters filled with tenderness to the sisters in other houses, reminding them that their mission did not end with Frances's death, but would continue precisely because of the foundation he had laid. She encouraged them to remain faithful to the spirit of gentleness that defined their order. She warned them against adopting harsh practices that contradicted Frances's vision. She reminded them again and again that holiness is built upon trust, patience, and humility, not dramatic acts of austerity. The death of Frances also awakened in her a new depth of compassion. She began to recognize more clearly the pain hidden within others. Her own suffering allowed her to enter into theirs with a tenderness that transformed the monastery into a true sanctuary. Sisters who struggled with discouragement sought her comfort. Widows who entered the order found in her a mirror of their own brokenness, healed by grace. Young novices, trembling with fear at the demands of religious life, discovered in her the gentle firmness of a mother who had walked through darkness and emerged with a faith strengthened by fire. Over time, Jane realized that Frances had not abandoned her. His voice lived on in the guiding principles of the Visitation, in the charism he had planted within the community, and in the memory of his words, which she carried within her heart like a hidden flame. His absence had forced her into maturity, into a deeper sharing in the cross of Christ, and into a leadership that was no longer dependent on a human guide, but anchored directly in God. This deepening of her interior life would form the bedrock for the years to come, years that would see the expansion of the order across France, the flourishing of vocations, and the birth of a spiritual legacy destined to touch countless souls. But even as the order grew, new trials awaited her. Trials not of external loss, but of daily, hidden sacrifices, the long, quiet path of ordinary holiness that would define her final decades. How would Jane continue leading the Visitation through these years of growth? And what hidden graces would God unfold as she embraced the slow, steady martyrdom of everyday fidelity? And so, with Frances de Sales now guiding her only from the silence of eternity, Jane stepped into a new chapter of her vocation, one defined not by dramatic events or external upheaval, but by the long, hidden labor of ordinary holiness. These were the years in which God asked her not to build through great deeds, but through daily fidelity, shaping her interior life quietly as the Visitation spread its gentle roots across the land. In the years following Frances's death, the Visitation began to grow with a quiet strength that surprised even those closest to the order. New foundations emerged across France, houses filled with women drawn by the spirit of gentleness, humility, and trust that defined the community. These foundations required guidance, stability, and maternal leadership. And so Jane traveled often, moving from one house to another, ensuring that the heart of the order, the charism entrusted to her and Frances, remained unbroken, unaltered, and alive. These journeys were not glamorous. They took her through harsh weather, over long roads, and into unfamiliar towns, where she was greeted not with honor, but with the practical needs of fledgling communities. She slept in simple quarters, ate modest meals, and spent long hours in council with superiors who needed direction. Yet each journey deepened her sense of mission. She realized that the Visitation did not belong to her, nor to Frances, but to God alone. Her task was simply to protect its essence, the gentle imitation of Mary in her visit to Elizabeth, charity offered without noise, without grandeur, and without seeking recognition. Her letters during these years reveal a soul increasingly purified by humility. She rarely spoke of herself. Instead, she wrote with warmth and insight to sisters across the various houses, offering guidance on everything from handling misunderstandings to cultivating interior peace. Her advice always bore the same spirit Frances had taught her. Do everything gently, trust God's providence, and do not be surprised by your own weaknesses. "We climb to heaven by the low valley of humility," she reminded them. A lesson she had learned not through theory, but through the long experience of her own trials. Yet these were not years free of suffering. Jane continued to carry the grief of her separation from Frances, a grief that would never fully leave her. At times, she felt a spiritual dryness so deep that prayer became an act of sheer will. The presence of God, once so tangible through the voice of her spiritual father, now often hid itself behind the veil of silence. But she did not withdraw. She did not seek consolations. She learned instead to pray with the quiet persistence of someone who offers herself, even when she receives nothing in return. This purification extended into her leadership. She faced misunderstandings from sisters who misinterpreted her gentleness as weakness, or who believed they could improve the order by imposing stricter practices. Jane resisted these impulses firmly but quietly. She understood that the Visitation's mission, to welcome women of fragile health and delicate dispositions, would be destroyed by austerity. She reminded the sisters that the heart of their vocation was not mortification, but humility and charity. She knew that harshness often masqueraded as zeal, and she guided her communities to resist the temptation toward severity. This quiet defense of gentleness became one of her most enduring gifts to the Church. Her compassion extended to the poor who came to the doors of the monastery. Though the sisters themselves lived in simplicity, Jane ensured that no one was turned away without some form of help: a piece of bread, a warm cloak, a listening ear. She believed that every act of charity, no matter how small, carried the tenderness of Christ. Her understanding of human suffering was profound. She had walked through grief, poverty, uncertainty, and loneliness, and she recognized these shadows in the eyes of those who sought help. Many later testified that a simple conversation with her brought them peace they had not known for years. Her own family, too, remained a source of concern and love. Though she had entrusted her children to God, she never ceased praying for them. Her son, whose impulsive nature had long troubled her, continued to cause her sorrow through reckless behavior and poor choices. Jane carried this suffering silently, offering it to God as a part of the sacrifice of her vocation. She wrote to him with maternal tenderness, urging him toward virtue without reproach, reminding him that God's mercy never abandons a repentant heart. Her patience with his failings reflected the same gentleness she showed her sisters, never harsh, never despairing, always anchored in hope. Within the monastery, Jane became known not only as the foundress, but as a mother whose presence imparted peace. The sisters often observed the way she moved through the convent, quietly, without hurry, attentive to the smallest needs. She comforted the sick personally, sometimes spending long hours at their bedside, whispering prayers or offering a soothing hand. She tended to the novices with a mix of firmness and tenderness, helping them navigate the fears and uncertainties of their vocation. She corrected with kindness, taught with patience, and always sought to look beyond the surface of actions to the deeper movements of the heart. Her leadership was marked by a remarkable balance. She was strong without being harsh, authoritative without being rigid, gentle without being indulgent. She knew that true holiness is not loud or dramatic, but steady, consistent, and rooted in love. She reminded her sisters often that God does not ask for extraordinary acts, but for simple fidelity offered with a generous heart. Her own life became a living testament to this truth. Her interior life deepened as well. Though she often endured spiritual dryness, she cultivated an abiding trust in God's presence. She no longer sought the emotional consolations she had once experienced under Frances's guidance. Instead, she embraced a more mature faith, one built on the quiet certainty that God remains faithful even when the soul feels lost. This purification allowed her to love more freely, more purely, without seeking anything in return. As the visitation grew, news of Jane's holiness began to spread quietly beyond the walls of the convent. People sought her counsel, desiring the wisdom of a woman who had learned to find God not in extraordinary events, but in the hidden offerings of daily life. Bishops, nobles, widows, and mothers wrote to her, asking for guidance in their own struggles. She answered each letter patiently, mindful that every soul carries burdens unseen. Yet, despite the admiration that grew around her, Jane remained profoundly humble. She attributed everything to God, insisting that she was simply His instrument. She often said, "God uses the weak to show His strength." In her heart, she believed that her own nothingness was the space through which God worked most freely. But even as grace flowed through her in countless ways, the path ahead wasn't free of further suffering. Life had already taken much from her: her husband, her beloved Frances, and the daily consolations of early prayer. Soon, new trials would rise, not from dramatic loss, but from the slow weight of physical frailty, misunderstandings within her community, and the continuing sorrows of her family. These trials would not break her. They would deepen her. They would prepare her for the final chapters of her life, when the gentle flame of her holiness would shine brighter precisely because it had been purified through so many hidden fires. What challenges would meet her now, in these later years of leadership? And how would her unwavering gentleness, tested again and again, continue shaping the spirit of the visitation? And so, from those steady years of hidden labor, years in which her soul, like a quiet flame, burned with a tenderness both tested and strengthened by sorrow, we now follow Jane into the later chapters of her life, where the weight of leadership, the demands of her growing order, and the enduring concerns for her family press more heavily upon her than ever before. These are the years in which suffering no longer arrives as a sudden blow, but as a constant companion, asking her to surrender herself not once, but again and again, in the long, slow offering of love. As the visitation expanded, carrying its gentle spirit into new corners of France, Jane found herself responsible for dozens of houses, hundreds of sisters, and countless souls who sought her guidance. Each foundation brought its own joys: new vocations, flourishing communities, unexpected graces, but also new trials. The practical burdens alone were immense, ensuring that each house remained true to the original charism, resolving disputes that arose among the sisters, mediating misunderstandings between communities, and responding to the concerns of bishops who oversaw the order. Her letters from this period reveal a woman stretched thin by responsibility, yet never hardened by it. Even when fatigued, she responded with patience. Even when misunderstood, she answered with gentleness. Her heart, expanded by suffering, seemed capable of absorbing the needs of an entire spiritual family. But the larger the order grew, the more complicated its governance became. Some sisters, zealous and well-intentioned, pushed for stricter practices, believing that austerity would elevate the sanctity of their communities. These pressures unsettled the delicate balance Frances had envisioned, and Jane, entrusted with preserving that vision, felt the strain acutely. She found herself continually defending the gentleness of the visitation, reminding the sisters that God desired humility more than rigor, charity more than self-imposed hardship. "God is not found in violence," she wrote. Our life must reflect the humility of Mary, not the severity of the Desert Fathers. Yet her insistence on moderation sometimes provoked criticism. A few accused her of being too lenient, too soft. Others doubted her wisdom. Such judgments pierced her deeply, not because they wounded her pride, but because they threatened the unity and purpose of the order she had given her life to serve. Beyond the monastery walls, her concerns for her family did not fade. Her son, Cels Benigna, continued to be a source of anxiety. His impulsiveness, which had worried her since his youth, grew into a pattern of recklessness as he reached adulthood. He struggled with debts, made imprudent decisions, and lived a life that often drifted far from the values she had tried to instill in him. Jane carried his burdens like a stone upon her heart. She prayed for him daily, entrusting him to God with a mother's unwavering hope. In her letters to him, she offered advice marked not by reproach, but by compassion. She believed, with a conviction born of faith, that no soul is beyond the reach of God's mercy, no matter how far it wanders. Even her daughters, though more stable, brought their own concerns, their marriages, their children, their changing circumstances. All these uncertainties weighed upon her. She longed at times to be a more present mother and grandmother, to offer comfort and guidance, to shield them from sorrow as she once had. But she knew that God had asked her to trust Him with their lives. She surrendered them to His providence daily, even as her mother's heart remained tender and vulnerable. Within the walls of the Visitation, the burdens grew heavier as Jane herself grew older. Her body, once strong enough to endure long journeys and endless responsibilities, began to weaken. She suffered from painful headaches, bouts of fatigue, and physical ailments that made ordinary tasks increasingly difficult. Yet she refused to withdraw from the sisters or to lessen her involvement. Instead, she continued to oversee the order with the same steadfast devotion, moving slowly through the halls with an expression of peace that belied her discomfort. When her strength failed, she prayed. When prayer became difficult, she rested quietly in the presence of God, offering her weakness as a form of silent love. Her patience during these years became one of her greatest teachings. She demonstrated that holiness is not found only in great sacrifices, but in the daily endurance of small suffering. She accepted misunderstandings without bitterness, fatigue without complaint, and disappointment without discouragement. Her sisters often remarked that her suffering made her even gentler, as though God were polishing her soul through each trial, refining her heart until it reflected His tenderness with increasing purity. One particular grief during this period carved itself more deeply into her than any other: the loss of her eldest son. Despite her prayers and her motherly love, Cels Benigna continued along his troubled path, and eventually his life was cut short in a tragic accident. He died far from her, without the chance for a final goodbye. When word reached her, Jane felt the full weight of maternal sorrow crash over her. She collapsed into tears, crying out not only in grief, but in the pain of having hoped so fiercely for his redemption. Yet even in the depths of her anguish, she did not turn away from God. Instead, she placed her son's soul entirely into His mercy, trusting that God had received him with the same tenderness that she had offered him throughout his life. This loss marked her profoundly. For days, she struggled to rise from her grief, moving like a woman carrying a wound too heavy to name. But slowly, quietly, grace began to pull her upward again. She understood, in a way she had never grasped before, that God asks mothers, both biological and spiritual, to love without claiming ownership, to give without demanding return, and to trust even when hope seems lost. Her own sorrow deepened her compassion for others who suffered. It enlarged her heart in ways that allowed her to console widows, mothers, and grieving sisters with an intimacy she had not previously possessed. As the years continued, Jane's life took on a rhythm shaped almost entirely by gentleness. Gentleness toward others, toward herself, and above all, toward God's will. She often said that humility and kindness were the two wings that lift the soul toward holiness. She taught her sisters that patience with oneself is as necessary as patience with others, for God's grace rarely works at the pace of human desire. In her conferences and letters, she encouraged the sisters to trust the slow work of God in their hearts, reminding them that sanctity is not achieved through force, but through surrender. Her leadership became more contemplative as she aged. She spoke less, listened more, and allowed her presence, steady, warm, and luminous, to communicate the wisdom she had gained through decades of prayer, suffering, and service. Her face, marked by lines of both sorrow and serenity, radiated a peace that drew others to her like a quiet flame. Young novices often sought her counsel, sitting at her feet in the dim light of the cloister as she offered them stories from her life. Stories that revealed not her achievements, but God's faithfulness in her weakness. Yet even in these years of peace, Jane's life did not drift into passivity. She continued to travel when necessary, though the journeys took more from her each time. She continued to guide the order through difficult decisions, always choosing what she believed would preserve the visitation's true identity. She continued to pray with a trust that grew deeper as her body grew frailer. And she continued to love, quietly, generously, without measure. Through all of these later trials, Jane's soul was being prepared, quietly and tenderly, for the final purification that would usher her into the last chapter of her earthly pilgrimage. What awaited her now as her strength waned and her heart turned more fully toward eternity? And how would God use these final years to complete the work he had begun in her soul so many decades before? And so, after long years of leadership fashioned through sorrow, patience, and unceasing charity, Jane entered the final stretch of her earthly pilgrimage, a season in which her strength slowly faded, yet her soul glowed ever more brightly with the quiet radiance of one who has surrendered everything. These last years, marked not by outward drama, but by a steady interior flame, would become the most eloquent expression of her sanctity, the gentle completion of a life poured out in love. With age, Jane's body yielded more noticeably to the weariness accumulated over decades of sacrifice. The years of travel, the hidden tears, the unspoken burdens, and the continual offering of herself in service to her daughters in religion had left their imprint. Her step grew slower, her breathing more labored, and her nights more restless. Yet the frailty that overcame her limbs did nothing to dim the strength of her spirit. If anything, her gentleness deepened. She seemed to move through the monastery with the quiet serenity of someone who had already begun to detach from the weight of earthly concerns, her thoughts turning more frequently toward eternity. She continued her travels as long as she could, visiting the new houses of the Visitation with a mother's affection. The sisters viewed her arrival with deep emotion, for her presence carried a sense of warmth, peace, and holiness that lifted their hearts. They would gather around her, listening to her speak with a tenderness that seemed to rise from a deep well of compassion. She shared with them her memories of Frances de Sales, her early struggles, her joys, and the lessons God had taught her in the hidden folds of everyday life. These visits strengthened the unity of the order, reminding the sisters that they belonged to a spiritual family rooted not in rules alone, but in love. But eventually, Her body could no longer endure the demands of travel. She returned to Annecy, where she spent her final years offering guidance from her cell. A modest room with a small wooden bed, a crucifix, and a window that opened to the cloister garden. There, in the golden softness of late afternoons and the cool hush of early mornings, she prayed for her sisters, for her family, and for all those who had asked for her intercession. Her prayer grew simpler with time. Words gave way to silence, petitions to surrender. She no longer sought answers or consolations. She simply opened her heart to God, trusting that He would complete in her what He had begun so many years before. Her daughters in religion drew near to her with increasing frequency during these years. They sought her counsel on matters large and small, and she offered guidance with a humility that astonished them. She never spoke as one who possessed wisdom, but as one who had been taught by the slow and gentle hand of God. When novices expressed fear about their weaknesses, she reassured them that weakness itself is a place where God delights to dwell. When superiors worried about conflicts in their communities, she advised them to govern with kindness, reminding them that authority without compassion becomes a burden, not a blessing. When sisters felt discouraged by spiritual dryness, she told them gently that God often hides Himself to deepen love, and that fidelity in dryness is dearer to Him than fervor in consolation. One of the greatest purifications of her final years came in the form of misunderstandings within the order. As the visitation grew, not all sisters agreed on how to apply the teachings of Frances de Sales. Some believed she had grown too lenient. Others felt she preserved the original spirit of the order too strictly. These tensions, while painful, became a crucible in which her humility was refined. She never defended herself, never asserted her authority in a way that might wound another. Instead, she listened, prayed, and answered with gentleness, trusting that time and grace would bring clarity. She bore criticism with the same serenity with which she had borne praise, seeing in every trial an opportunity to abandon herself more completely to God. Her final purification came with the decline of her physical health. Pain became a daily companion. Sleep grew fitful. She experienced episodes of weakness so severe that the sisters feared for her life. Yet she complained of nothing. When they asked how she felt, she would smile faintly and say only, "As God wills." She offered each discomfort quietly, believing that suffering, when united to the cross, becomes a hidden form of love. The sisters who cared for her often left her cell with tears, moved not by her pain, but by the tenderness with which she embraced it. In these years, she also reflected more deeply on her past, the death of her husband, the farewell to her children, the loss of Frances, the grief of her son's troubled life and tragic death. Rather than dwell on regret, she thanked God for each sorrow, seeing in them the chisels that had shaped her soul into what it had become. She came to understand, with a clarity that only the aged and faithful possess, that nothing in her life, neither joy nor loss, had been accidental. Everything had been held within the gentle providence of God, who had woven her wounds into a tapestry of grace she had never imagined. Her final journey began unexpectedly. In 1641, Jane was asked to visit the Visitation House in Moulins. Though her strength had diminished greatly, she sensed an interior prompting to go, a quiet insistence that came not from duty, but from God's mysterious will. She obeyed, though she told her sisters gently, "I feel that this journey will be my last." They pleaded with her to remain in Annecy, fearing that the strain of travel would harm her fragile health. But Jane, always attentive to the whispers of grace, prepared herself for the road, trusting that God would sustain her for as long as he wished. The journey was difficult. The roads were rough, the weather cold, and her body weary. Yet she offered every discomfort to God, with the quiet joy of one who knows she is nearing home. When she arrived in Moulins, the sisters welcomed her with reverence and love, unaware that they were receiving her for the last time. Jane spent her remaining days among them in humble service, speaking with the novices, comforting the sick, offering guidance with her characteristic sweetness. She moved slowly, leaning on the arms of the sisters, her breath short, her steps unsteady. Yet her face seemed more luminous than ever, as though the nearness of heaven had begun to cast its light upon her features. In those final days, she spoke often of trust. Trust in God's will, trust in his mercy, trust in his mysterious ways. She urged the sisters to hold fast to the spirit of the visitation, to remain gentle, humble, and faithful in all things. She reminded them that holiness lies not in extraordinary acts, but in daily fidelity lived with love. Her words, spoken softly from a body nearing its end, carried a weight that touched the hearts of all who heard them. As her strength faded, she asked to receive the sacraments. Surrounded by her daughters in religion, she whispered prayers with a serenity that astonished them. There was no fear in her, no resistance, only a quiet longing to meet the God she had served so faithfully in the hidden corners of her life. Her final hours unfolded with the tender simplicity that had marked her entire existence. She listened as the sisters prayed beside her bed, her breath growing fainter, her hands folded gently over her chest. In her last moments, she whispered one final act of trust. I belong entirely to him. And with that, she surrendered her soul into the merciful heart of God, completing the long offering that had begun on the day she made her first prayer as a child in Dijon. Her passing left the sisters in tears, yet also in awe. They felt her peace lingering in the room long after her breath had ceased, as though heaven had drawn near to receive her. Her life, shaped by grief, humility, gentleness, and unbroken faith, had become a living flame that would continue to warm hearts long after her earthly journey ended. How would this life, so quiet and hidden, now unfold into a legacy that would extend far beyond her time, touching not only her order, but the church and the faithful for generations to come? And so, after her gentle passing in the quiet sanctuary of Moulins, where her final breath slipped into eternity like a candle flame drawn upward by unseen hands, the life of Jane Frances de Chantal did not fade into silence. Rather, it began to shine with a new and lasting brilliance, illuminating hearts far beyond the cloister walls where she had spent her final years. What follows is the unfolding of her legacy, the way her hidden holiness blossomed into a gift for generations, and how her spirit continued to live in the order she helped build and in the countless souls she inspired. The days following her death were touched with a reverent, almost tangible peace. The sisters who had gathered at her bedside remained near her body, praying softly, weeping quietly. They felt as though they had witnessed not the end of a life, but the passing of something holy into God's embrace. Her face, even in death, bore a serenity that spoke more powerfully than any words could. A serenity shaped by decades of surrender, sacrifice, gentleness, and faith. News of her passing traveled quickly among the houses of the Visitation. From Annecy to Paris, from Lyons to Grenoble, the sisters received the message with a mixture of grief and awe. Though they mourned the loss of their foundress, they sensed that heaven had gained a mother whose intercession would now strengthen them more profoundly than ever. Her body was brought to Annecy, where she had lived most of her religious life. The journey resembled a quiet pilgrimage. People along the way paused to watch, some kneeling, others making the sign of the cross. They had heard whispers of her sanctity, of the widow who forgave her husband's killer, of the noble woman who embraced poverty, of the spiritual daughter of Frances de Sales, whose gentleness touched all who met her. The sight of her funeral procession stirred devotion in hearts that had never entered the cloister walls. In Annecy, crowds gathered in reverence as her body was laid to rest beside the one who had guided her so faithfully, Frances de Sales. It felt fitting that the two friends, united in life by God's design, would rest near each other in death, their legacies intertwined like two branches from the same tree. But it was not only the sisters of the Visitation who felt her loss. Many who had corresponded with her, bishops, nobles, widows, mothers, young women seeking their place in the world, expressed sorrow at the passing of a woman whose counsel had guided them through their own trials. Priests spoke of her patience, her clarity of spirit, her unfailing kindness. Lay people remembered her humility and charity, her quiet willingness to help the poor, her ability to listen without judgment. Even those who had never met her began to hear of her through stories passed from community to community, stories of her unwavering trust in God despite her many sorrows. The order she founded did not falter after her death. Instead, it grew. The seeds she had planted through decades of sacrifice bore fruit in dozens of new foundations. The sisters who had learned from her saw it as their duty to preserve the spirit she had embodied, the spirit of gentleness, humility, and charity that formed the heart of the Visitation. They studied her letters carefully, treasuring them as windows into the soul of their mother. Her spiritual teachings, simple yet profound, continued to guide the communities long after her voice was silenced. "Let your hearts be wide," she had often said. "Let them be large enough to hold the sorrows and joys of others." And the sisters, remembering this, sought to live with the wide, compassionate hearts she had taught them to cultivate. As the decades passed, her reputation for holiness continued to grow. Miracles were reported at her intercession, healings, conversions, and consolations that seemed to bear her familiar imprint of tenderness and peace. Those who prayed to her often described a sense of comfort, as though she drew near with the same motherly gentleness she had shown during her life. The faithful began to speak of her as a saint long before the Church officially recognized her sanctity. 2 centuries after her death, the Church began the process of examining her life in detail. Witnesses who had known her testified to her charity, her humility, her wisdom. Her letters, preserved with care, revealed a soul guided by the Holy Spirit, capable of profound insight and deep compassion. The testimonies spoke not of dramatic visions or extraordinary penances, but of a consistent, quiet holiness lived out through decades of ordinary faithfulness. It was this constancy, this hidden strength, this gentleness refined through suffering that convinced the Church of her sanctity. In 1767, Pope Clement III declared her a saint, recognizing officially what generations of Visitation sisters and countless faithful had long believed, that Jane Frances de Chantal was a woman whose life had been shaped by God in a way that radiated His love to the world. Her canonization was not the culmination of her mission, but a new beginning. It brought renewed attention to her writings, her teachings, and the order she had helped found. Her example inspired new vocations, new foundations, new hearts drawn to the gentle path of holiness she had shown. Her legacy also lived on through the Visitation Order itself, which continued to flourish across Europe and eventually into the Americas. The spirit she had instilled, one of serenity, humility, and charity became a distinctive mark of the community. Even today, centuries after her death, the Visitation continues to welcome women of all backgrounds, including those who might not be strong enough for harsher rules, offering them a place to encounter God through simplicity, gentleness, and loving service. This fidelity to her founding vision is perhaps the greatest tribute her daughters in religion have given her. Beyond the order, her influence touched the wider church in surprising ways. One of the most significant legacies connected to the Visitation emerged centuries after her death, when a young Visitation nun named Margaret Mary Alacoque received visions of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. These revelations, which would eventually shape Catholic devotion worldwide, took place within the very environment Jane had helped create, an environment of gentleness, contemplation, and profound trust. Though Jane had passed long before Margaret Mary was born, the spiritual atmosphere she nurtured became the soil that allowed the devotion to the Sacred Heart to take root and flourish. In this way, her influence reached across time, linking her life to movements of grace she could never have imagined. Even today, people continue to find solace in her story. Those who have lost spouses, children, or spiritual guides see in her a companion on the path of grief. Those who feel torn between family responsibilities and spiritual longing discover in her life a model of trust. Those who struggle with the quiet trials of daily life, fatigue, misunderstanding, loneliness, find comfort in her witness that holiness is built not on extraordinary deeds, but on quiet, faithful endurance. And those who long for deeper gentleness in a world often marked by harshness look to her as a reminder that love, in its purest form, flows from humility. Her story reaches across centuries because it speaks to universal truths, that God works through suffering, that sanctity is found in daily fidelity, that gentleness is a strength rarely recognized but deeply needed, and that every soul, no matter how wounded, can become a vessel of divine love. In the end, the legacy of Saint Jane Frances de Chantal is not a grand monument or a brilliant theological work, but a spirit, soft, steady, and deeply human. It is the spirit of a woman who allowed God to shape her through sorrow and joy, who surrendered without bitterness, who loved without measure, and who continues to whisper across generations the same gentle message she once offered her sisters. Trust God. Let Him lead you gently. He knows the way. And so her story, born of quiet beginnings, shaped by trial, and crowned with holiness, becomes for us a reminder that the paths of the saints are often woven not through wonders, but through the secret, hidden labor of love.